The year was 1901, and the town of Whitby sat quietly by the North Sea, its cobblestone streets lined with gas lamps and the faint smell of salt drifting inland. Life moved at a slower rhythm here. Fishermen returned at dawn. Children played near the harbor, and women in long skirts carried baskets of bread and vegetables from the market. It was the kind of town that seemed safe, ordinary, untouched by the darker parts of the world. But like every place, it had secrets. Some lay buried deep in the past, while others lived silently in the houses people walked by every day without a second thought. The photograph appeared to be nothing more than a piece of family history when it was taken. A group gathered in front of an old house, their expressions stiff, as was common in that era when holding still for the camera took patience. The clothes were neat, the children were pressed close together, and the adults stood tall, trying to present their best selves to whoever would look at the picture in the years to come. It's something in the way their eyes seemed to avoid each other, and the tension of their bodies gave the image an unease that only revealed itself slowly. At first glance, it was ordinary. Look closer, and it whispered of something waiting to break through the surface. The family at the center of it all seemed respectable. The father was a businessman, known for his stern ways, but also for providing work to a handful of locals. His wife carried herself with quiet grace, though people often said she seemed more like a shadow than a woman. The children, all dressed in their Sunday best, carried the innocence of youth, yet there was a heaviness about them that didn't belong in faces so young. Neighbors didn't talk about it out loud, but they noticed. People always notice more than they say. Whitby was not a place of wealth, but this family stood a little taller in society than most. Their house sat at the edge of town, slightly apart from the others, with its tall windows and heavy curtains that stayed drawn more often than not. Inside, the air felt different. While other homes hummed with warmth and chatter, there seemed quiet, almost too quiet, as if voices had learned to lower themselves for fear of echoing too loudly. From the outside, life looked steady. The father walked to town each morning, his black coat brushing against his legs, his hat pulled low over his brow. He shook hands firmly with other men, spoke in clipped sentences, and always kept a watchful eye on who was watching him. His wife tended to the children, often seen leading them by the hand through the marketplace. Her gaze fixed ahead, her lips pressed tight, as though she lived in a world of her own thoughts. To anyone passing by, they might seem like any family balancing duty, pride, and the weight of expectation. But beneath the surface, something simmered. The children rarely played with others their age. Instead, they were kept close, their laughter fading quickly when their father's shadow passed over them. Behind the closed doors of the tall house, discipline was more than stern. It was absolute. Rules were not questioned. Mistakes were not forgiven easily. Love, if it existed, came in fragments, given sparingly, leaving more hunger than comfort. Yet in the photograph, when all of them stood together, there was no shouting, no harsh words. Only silence so heavy it seemed to seep from the paper itself. Those who worked for the family spoke in hushed tones. Servants didn't stay long. Some said the father's temper was hard to endure. Others hinted at strange happenings inside the house at night, sounds that carried down the long hallways, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. But such talk was brushed off. In 1901, people were quick to hide things behind locked doors and polished appearances. It was easier to pretend than to confront the truth. And yet, in a way the wife's hand rested stiffly on her youngest child's shoulder, or how the eldest boy looked not at the camera but off to the side, there was something unsettled. The photograph caught it without meaning to, freezing a moment of unease in time. To an outsider, it might have looked like nothing, but to those who knew the family, it was a reflection of the quiet storm that always seemed to hang over them. What made the story all the more chilling was how ordinary it all seemed. People saw the family walk to church, sit in the same pew, nod politely to neighbors, and return home with their heads held high. Nothing in their daily lives shouted danger. And yet, when the photograph was taken, it was as if the camera, without judgment, captured the weight of unspoken truths. It held the shadows that the family itself tried so hard to ignore. In Whitby, gossip had a way of weaving itself into daily life, though this family was spared most of it, if only because people feared the father's reach. He had influence, and no one wanted to find themselves on the wrong side of it. Still, there were whispers of the wife's loneliness, of the children's sadness, of the way the house felt cold even on warm summer days. These things lingered at the edges of conversations, half-spoken, quickly silenced. The photograph, when it was first developed, was just one more picture to place in an album. But over time, as events unfold, people would look back at it and see what they had missed. They would see the cracks in the smiles, the stiffness in the poses, the strange shadows in the background. What once looked harmless would become a reminder that nothing is ever as simple as it seems. For now, though, in the summer of 1901, the family still stood together, their secrets locked away, their daily routines carrying on as if nothing was wrong. The town still carried on with its rhythm. Children laughing, church bells ringing, ships drifting out to sea. But something was already shifting, something that would not stay hidden for long. The photograph had captured more than faces. It had captured the fragile balance of a world waiting to fall apart. The photograph, when first placed in its album, carried only the stiffness of formality. Yet within the family it captured, tensions had already begun to tighten like ropes around their throats. The days in Whitby grew longer as summer stretched on, but inside the tall house, time seemed to slow, pressing heavily on each member of the family. They moved through routines with the same careful rhythm, but the silence in their home was no longer just quiet. It had turned brittle, sharp, ready to break with the smallest crack. The father's temper began to show more openly. He had always been a man of control, but control turned to dominance when the weight of his business started pressing harder than before. The fishing trade was changing, competitors grew stronger, and debts he did not speak of began to pile beneath the surface. His handshakes in town remained firm, his voice steady, but at home, his patience thinned. The smallest mistakes, a dropped plate, a poorly tied shoelace, a laugh too loud at the wrong time, were met with cold words, then sharper ones. His children learned to lower their eyes, his wife to retreat further into herself. She, once merely quiet, became almost ghost-like. Her days were spent in silence, her movements measured, as though she lived in constant fear of stirring something within him. When neighbors saw her, they commented on how pale she looked, how thin. Some said grief clung to her, though no one could point to what she had lost. What she carried was harder to name. Years of isolation, the slow suffocation of a marriage where her voice mattered less than the curtains drawn across her windows. The children clung to her, seeking the comfort their father did not give, but she had little left to offer them. The eldest son began to change in ways that unsettled everyone. He was only 14, but his shoulders were already hunched from carrying, a weight too heavy for him. He had learned his father's anger by watching, and though he was not yet cruel, there were flashes of it, moments when he scolded his younger siblings with a tone too sharp, his face tightening in imitation of the man he feared most. At night, he lay awake, torn between protecting his brothers and sisters and trying to avoid the wrath that seemed to fall on him most often. The more he tried to shield them, the more he became a target, and bitterness began to root itself inside him. Jealousy seeped into the household like damp through stone. The father favored his younger daughter, a girl of delicate health who often fell ill. She became, in his eyes, something to be guarded fiercely. He softened only around her, his voice lowering, his hand brushing gently over her hair in a way he never showed the others. To the rest of the children, this love was both a shield and a curse. They envied her tenderness, resented the way she alone could melt his sternness, even as they also feared the burden of his attention upon her. It made her mother uneasy, too, though she never spoke of it. She simply watched from a distance, her lips pressed together, her thoughts locked away. The cracks deepened when the father's business struggles grew harder to hide. Bills arrived more often, letters written in firm handwriting demanding payment. Servants whispered of late-night arguments between husband and wife, though the wife's voice was rarely raised. They spoke of objects thrown against the wall, of footsteps pacing the hallway until dawn. Money, reputation, and pride. These three forces pressed on him with equal weight, and with nowhere else to release them, he turned inward, into the home, into the people he owned in his mind as surely as he owned the roof over their heads. Outside the family, societal pressures also pressed closer. In Whitby, appearances mattered, especially for those who lived above the fishermen and traders. A man was judged by his standing, his control over his household, and his ability to hold power in public spaces. Any sign of weakness could be exploited, and so the father doubled down on keeping his family in order, reminding them often that their duty was not just to him, but to the reputation of his name. This meant silence in public, obedience in private, and never, ever speaking of the shadows within their home. But children, even when silenced, find ways to speak. The younger ones grew restless. They whispered to each other in the dark, sharing their fears like secrets, turning their confusion into stories to make sense of what they could not say aloud. Sometimes, in their games, they imitated their father, his booming voice and commanding presence. Their laughter during these moments carried an edge. It was laughter that knew too much. Their mother heard it and felt her stomach twist, but she said nothing, only tucked them in tighter, as though a blanket could keep the darkness out. The photograph itself became a point of quiet obsession. The mother kept it on a table in the parlor, her eyes drawn to it when she passed by. She studied the expressions, the stiffness, the way the children clung to her more than their father. The eldest son avoided looking at it altogether, as if the paper carried some accusation against him. The father, on the other hand, pointed to it when scolding them, saying it was proof of what they should be, a respectable family, united and strong. To him, it was not memory, but evidence, something to uphold, a mask to wear even as the truth beneath grew darker. Old grievances began to resurface. The wife, though outwardly obedient, had once been promised a different life, a marriage bill. Tea on stability and gentleness. Her own family had urged the match, impressed by the man's ambition, his money, his standing. She had accepted, believing in the future it offered. Now, years later, she carried the quiet rage of betrayal, though it never left her lips. It lived instead in the tightness of her jaw, the way her eyes drifted away when he entered a room. He saw it, and it only fueled his need to dominate, to remind her of the choices she no longer had. The town, too, became complicit in its silence. Neighbors saw bruises on the children's arms, caught the edge of fear in their voices when asked too much, but they said nothing. In 1901, the affairs of a household were just that, private. To interfere was to cross a line. And so, people turned away, convincing themselves they had misread what they saw. What no one noticed was how the eldest boy's bitterness grew into something sharper. He began keeping secrets of his own, sneaking away to the harbor, lingering near men who drank and swore, listening to stories of escape, of leaving everything behind. In his heart, the line between protection and revenge blurred. He dreamed of standing up to his father, of ending the fear once and for all, but the thought scared him as much as it thrilled him. Within the house, nights became the most dangerous time. Whispers gave way to arguments, footsteps to slammed doors. The younger children huddled together, their wide eyes staring at the dark. Their mother paced silently, pressing her hands together until her knuckles whitened, as though praying for something to intervene. The father moved through the rooms like a storm, his shadow stretching long across the walls, reminding everyone that no matter how much they wished to escape, the house was his, and so were they. The photograph had frozen them in place, but in real life, the family was unraveling. Each day brought another thread pulled loose, another moment of jealousy, another demand, another secret kept. And though none of them could name it yet, something was drawing closer. The fragile balance could not last forever. They were heading toward a breaking point, one that would shatter everything the photograph tried to capture. The house stood heavy with silence that night, its tall windows glinting faintly under the dim light of the moon. Inside, the air was dense, thick with the weight of unspoken words and smothered anger. The children had been sent to bed early after another evening of scolding, their dinner cold and untouched. Upstairs, whispers passed between them in the dark, fear mixing with the restless energy that always came when their father's temper boiled over. Below, in the parlor, the storm gathered. The father had returned late from town, the sharp smell of tobacco clinging to his coat, his voice harsh as he tossed his hat onto the table. Letters lay scattered there, unpaid bills that burned his pride more than his pocket. His wife stood by the window, her hands twisting the hem of her apron, her face pale in the glow of the lamp. She had tried, gently at first, to ask about the letters. He had cut her off with a sharp word, then another, until her silence became the only defense she had left. But silence only fed his fury. The eldest boy lingered on the staircase, his heart pounding. He knew better than to listen, but something in him needed to stay. He had heard enough nights end in slammed doors and broken things. Tonight felt different, heavier, like the air before a thunderclap. He crouched low, hidden in the shadows, his fists tight against his knees. The argument spiraled quickly. The father's voice grew louder, his words no longer about money, but about obedience, respect, the humiliation he felt in a world that seemed to turn against him. He turned his anger on her, his wife, accusing her of weakness, of failing him, of raising children who cowered instead of obeying. She stood trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor, her lips pressed so tight they bled faintly at the corners. It happened fast, a moment that shifted from words to violence in a breath. His hand, open at first, struck her across the face, the sound echoing through the house like a crack of thunder. The children upstairs froze, their whispers silenced. The eldest boy flinched but did not move. Then, as if the strike had not been enough, the father gripped her arm, shaking her, his fury spilling over in a torrent of shouts that made the walls themselves seem to shiver. The eldest boy could not watch any longer. Something inside him broke. He ran to the kitchen, his mind a blur, his breath shallow. His hand found the heavy iron poker by the hearth, still faintly warm from the fire earlier in the evening. He clutched it tight, his knuckles white, his thoughts screaming louder than his fear. For years, she had dreamed of stopping it, of protecting her, of ending the fear that haunted every night. Now, without planning, without thought, he was moving back toward the parlor. His footsteps were louder than he wanted them to be, but the father was too caught in his rage to notice until the boy was upon him. The iron poker swung with all the force his young arms could summon. It struck the side of his father's head with a dull, sickening thud. The sound silenced everything, the shouts, the trembling, even the house itself. The father staggered, his eyes wide with shock, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Blood bloomed dark against his temple. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The boy stood frozen, the poker still in his hand, his breath ragged. His mother's eyes were wide, her hand pressed against her mouth as if to hold and scream. The father swayed, his body lurching forward, his arms flailing as though trying to catch himself. Then he fell, his body collapsing onto the floorboards with a weight that rattled the lamp on the table. Silence. Only the sound of the lamp's flame flickering. The boy's chest heaved, his arms trembling, the poker slipping from his hand and clattering against the floor. His mother dropped to her knees beside her husband, her hands hovering over him but never quite touching. Blood spread slowly beneath his head, staining the wood dark. His breath came in ragged gasps, shallow and uneven. His eyes, once full of rage, now carried something else, shock, disbelief, and perhaps the faint trace of fear. The children upstairs began to cry, their wails breaking through the silence. The mother looked up toward the stairs, then back to the boy, her face pale as chalk. "What have you done?" she whispered, though her voice was barely audible at all. The boy's mouth opened, but no words came. His chest ached, his heart racing so fast he thought it might break out of him. He had wanted to protect her, to stop him, to end the nightmare. But now, standing over his father's bleeding body, all he felt was terror, terror of what he had done, of what would come next, of how the world outside would see not the years of cruelty, but this single act. The father's breath grew weaker, each one a rasping struggle. He tried to move, his hand twitching faintly, but his body refused him. His wife reached for his hand, tears blurring her vision, though it was not clear if they were for him or for the life they all now faced. The boy fell to his knees, his hands covering his face. His mind screamed at him, telling him it was too late to take it back. He felt the weight of everything pressing down. The years of silence, the fear, the bruises, the cold meals, the shouting, the blows. And now this. The youngest daughter crept halfway down the stairs, clutching the rail with trembling fingers. Her wide eyes stared at the scene below, the blood, the stillness, the poker on the floor. She whimpered softly, a sound that cut through the air like glass. Her mother saw her and shouted for her to go back up, her voice breaking, more desperate than commanding. But it was too late. The whole house knew. Every child knew. The crime was no longer a secret kept between a boy and the shadows. It had spilled out into all of them, binding them together in something they could never escape. Panic set in fast. The mother wiped her hands across her apron, smearing blood she hadn't meant to touch. Her eyes darted to the door, to the windows, to the poker on the floor. The boy stared at her, waiting, begging for direction, but she had none to give. Her world had shattered in an instant. She whispered again and again, "Oh God, oh God," but no God came to save them. The father lay still now, his chest rising only faintly, his face pale and slack. The final breath left him with a sound more like a sigh than a struggle, and then there was nothing. The room was silent once more, but this time it was the silence of death. The boy's hands shook violently as he reached for his mother, his voice breaking into sobs. "I didn't mean," he tried to say, but the words fell apart. She gripped his face in her hands, staring at him with eyes full of terror and something else, something that looked like both love and horror intertwined. She did not blame him, not fully, but she could not forgive him either. Not yet, maybe not ever. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but a quiet kind of chaos. The children crowded the landing upstairs, crying, whispering, clinging to one another. The mother began to move quickly, almost without thinking. She pulled the curtains tight, dimmed the lamp, pushed the poker under the hearth rug, as though hiding it would undo what had happened. She told the children to stay upstairs, her voice sharp now, commanding in a way it had never been before. The boy obeyed her every word, too stunned to resist. But the truth was already written on the floorboards, in the spreading pool of blood, in the lifeless body of the man who had ruled their lives. The crime had unfolded in less than a minute, but its shadow would stretch across all their lives. And though the boy had swung the iron, it was all of them who now carried the weight of it. The house that once stood as a mark of respect in Whitby changed overnight. The silence that had always lived inside its walls deepened into something heavier, unbearable, pressing on every corner of the rooms where the father's body had fallen. For hours after the crime, the family moved like shadows, whispering, pacing, trying to piece together what to do. The mother tried to hold herself, Audie, but her hands shook as she wiped blood from the floor, smearing more than cleaning. The boy sat on the stairs, staring at his hands as though they were no longer his, whispering under his breath that he hadn't meant it. The younger children cried until they could cry no more, their sobs trailing into hiccups and silence, their eyes wide with fear of what might come to be why mourning the father's death could not be hidden. A body cannot stay locked away in a house without someone noticing. Neighbors saw the curtains drawn, the children's pale faces peering from behind them. Whispers grew quickly. By afternoon, the truth was no longer containable. The authorities came, stern faces stepping into the parlor where the man had lain. The poker was found despite the mother's attempts to hide it. The sight of it, still smeared with blood, told more than any words could. The eldest boy did not run. He did not argue when they questioned him. He sat quietly, his eyes empty, and when pressed, he admitted what he had done. His voice cracked, the words stumbling from his mouth like stones. He spoke of fear, of years of anger, of wanting to protect his mother. But to the men who stood listening, the law cared less for reasons and more for the act itself. A boy had struck his father dead. That was enough to turn a family's private nightmare into the town's public scandal. For the mother, grief and guilt twisted together in ways she could not untangle. She had spent years suffering under the man who now lay in the ground, and yet she could not erase the memory of once believing he might give her a good life. She mourned him not as a husband she loved, but as a man whose shadow had shaped every choice she had made. Her guilt was heavier still for her son. She saw in his eyes the child who had wanted to save her, and in his hands the weapon that had destroyed them all. She told herself it was not his fault, that no child should carry such a burden. But in the stillness of night, she could not escape the thought that she had allowed it to come to this. The town's reaction was swift and merciless. For years, people had looked at the family with a mix of respect and unease. Now, with the father dead, they spoke freely of what they had seen but never said aloud. The bruises, the harsh words, the fear in the children's faces. But instead of sympathy, much of the blame turned inward on the family itself. Whispers spread of weakness, of scandal, of a household that had failed to remain respectable. The father, for all his cruelty, was remembered in some corners as a man of business, a figure of authority. The boy became the villain in the story, a child who had turned against his own blood. Legal consequences followed swiftly. Though only 14, the boy was brought before the court. The trial was whispered about across Whitby, every detail turning into rumor before it reached the truth. The courtroom was heavy with judgment, the air thick with curiosity and condemnation. The boy sat small on the bench, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed downward. He spoke little, his voice breaking when he tried. His mother sat nearby, pale and rigid, as though her very body had turned to stone. Her silence was seen as coldness by many, though in truth she was crumbling inside, too broken to defend or explain. Guilt consumed the boy. In the dark of his cell, he replayed the moment again and again. The iron poker, the sound of the strike, his father's eyes wide with shock. He thought of how his siblings had stared from the stairs, how his mother's hand had pressed against her mouth. He wanted to believe he had done it to save them, but the thought twisted inside him, making him wonder if he had been driven by more than protection. Perhaps there had been hatred too, the kind that had grown slowly inside him until it finally burst. The weight of that thought crushed him more than any bars around him could. The younger children carried our own scars. At school, other children whispered about them, pointing, mocking, turning tragedy into taunts. Their father was gone, their brother taken, their mother too distant to shield them. They carried the shame of a crime they had not committed, yet one that would follow them always. Their laughter, once rare, vanished altogether. They grew up faster than they should have, their innocence stolen in the span of a single night. In the community, the crime drew lines between those who whispered sympathy and those who turned cold with judgment. Some said the boy had done what many could not, that he had freed his family from a tyrant. Others condemned him, insisting that no matter the reason, blood spilled by a son against his father was unforgivable. Newspapers took to the story, painting it in black and white, their words stripping away the complexity of fear, control, and silent suffering. To the world, it became not a story of survival, but a tale of a broken family, one picture-perfect moment ruined forever. The mother, left behind with her younger children, became a ghost in her own town. People avoided her in the marketplace, their eyes sliding away as if looking at her was dangerous. Work was harder to find. Money grew thin. The house, once tall and proud, fell into quiet decay. Curtains still hung heavy, but now the silence inside was suffocating rather than tense. Nights stretched long with memories she could not push away. The face of her husband in his final breath, the sound of her son's sobs, the way the world had shifted in an instant. She tried to visit her son, to bring him food or a soft word, but each time she left more broken than before. He had once been her protector, her boy who stood tall despite fear. Now he was hollow, drowning in the weight of guilt. She told him she forgave him, but he turned his face away, refusing to believe it. Forgiveness, he said, could not bring back the man he had killed or erase the shame he had brought on them all in time. The boy's case was decided. Too young for the gallows, but not free of punishment. He was sent away to a place meant for reform, though everyone knew it was little more than a prison. His departure marked the final break of the family. The children clung to each other as he was taken, their cries piercing the air, while the mother stood still, her body shaking but her face set like stone. The town moved on, as towns always do, but the story lingered. The photograph, once a symbol of respectability, became a chilling reminder of what had been hiding behind the curtains. People looked at it differently now, no longer a portrait of a family, but a frozen warning of how silence and fear can rot a home from the inside out. The aftermath left no one untouched. The father's name faded, remembered more for the scandal of his death than the business he once ran. The mother lived with the double wound of grief and blame. The children grew in the shadow of their brother's crime, carrying whispers with them wherever they went. And the boy, who had once believed he could save them all, found himself locked away, his life defined by a single strike of iron. The crime had ended one man's tyranny, but it had also destroyed everything left behind. In its wake, there was no freedom, no peace, only a trail of loss that spread from one family into the heart of the town itself. Would you like me to carry this aftermath even further into the community's long-term memory of the crime? How decades later the photograph was viewed, retold, and turned into a local legend. For added depth and haunting effect, the trial that followed became a spectacle that stretched beyond the courtroom walls. Every newspaper, from the local dailies to the larger national presses, carried the story of the photo from 1901. The smiling group, the hidden cruelty, and the darkness that had poisoned what seemed to be an innocent summer gathering. What had once been a quiet, old family estate was now infamous. Neighbors whispered whenever the names were spoken, and families who once envied the portrait now crossed the street to avoid the house, as if tragedy and crime lingered like a curse in the very air. The court proceedings laid bare the secrets that many had tried to keep buried. Servants testified about hushed arguments late at night, about bruises and sudden silences at breakfast tables, about strange disappearances of letters and conversations stopped the moment footsteps were heard in the hallway. Those who had once seemed like pillars of the community were now described in terms that revealed pettiness, jealousy, and unchecked control. For many, it was a slow realization that the photograph had never been innocent at all. It had captured a moment heavy with hidden battles, a still image of lives already unraveling. The legal outcome was swift, though not everyone agreed. It was just. One stood accused as the mastermind, another as an accomplice, while others were painted as victims too frightened to speak until it was too late. Lawyers argued about motive, about opportunity, about who had truly held the power and who had simply been caught in its shadow. By the end, the guilty were sentenced, though whispers persisted that others had escaped punishment. Justice had been served on paper, but the truth, as always, seemed far more complicated. For the families left behind, the damage could never be repaired. The estate was sold at a loss, stripped of its former grandeur, and left to crumble into ruin. Children who had once played under its roof grew into adults carrying scars of betrayal, distrust, and shame. Some refused to ever speak of their last name again, while others fought to defend it, insisting that not everyone in the photograph deserved to be remembered for a single act of violence. The portrait itself became a symbol, passed from hand to hand, studied and whispered about. Some swore you could see the darkness in their eyes if you looked long enough, as if the camera had caught more than it was ever meant to. The broader community, too, was shaken. The crime forced people to question what they thought they knew about wealth and reputation. The idea that money and a family name could shield one from consequence was openly debated. Some saw the case as proof that power had always been able to bend the rules of justice, while others celebrated that, for once, the mask had slipped and the guilty had faced consequences. But beneath all of it was a quiet unease. If such cruelty could hide inside a family so admired, what might lurk behind the closed doors of their own neighbors? As the years passed, the story grew into something more than fact. It became legend, a cautionary tale parents told their children, and a reminder that appearances could never be trusted. The photograph from 1901 hung in local history exhibits, not as a token of nostalgia, but as an artifact of warning. People stood before it in silence, staring into the captured faces of those who once smiled so naturally, wondering what secrets were already growing behind those eyes. The image no longer seemed quaint. It carried weight, a heaviness that lingered long after you looked away, done on a deeper level. The case forced reflection on morality and human behavior. It showed how power, even in small and private forms, could twist bonds of love and loyalty into something cruel. It revealed how jealousy could erode trust, how silence could allow harm to fester, and how fear could chain good people into complicity. The story wasn't only about one family. It was about the dangerous ways humans justify their actions, the lies we tell ourselves to survive, and the darkness we're capable of hiding under a smile. Was justice truly served? Perhaps in part. The guilty were punished, but the pain could never be erased. Lives had been ruined, innocence stolen, trust shattered. The legacy of the crime lived on far longer than the people themselves, in whispers, in stories, and in that single haunting photograph. In the end, what lingered most was not just the tragedy of what had happened, but the unsettling truth it revealed. That beneath even the most ordinary image, the most carefully constructed mask, there can be shadows we refuse to see until it's too late. The story closes not with certainty, but with reflection. The photograph remains silent and unchanging, while generations continue to look at it and ask the same questions about morality, about justice, about the hidden depths of human nature. And maybe that is its true legacy, not the crime itself, but the reminder it leaves behind. That the human heart is far more complex than any picture can ever capture. And sometimes, what looks innocent is the most dangerous thing of all.